believe this is the last episode. It has been 4 months and it has been a crazy ride. But they say all good things must come to an end. Welcome back to my channel, and today I'm bringing you the last episode in my Lips vs. Eyes series that I have been doing with Brandy, Shay and Samantha. I'll have all of them linked down below. And just a quick reminder that the Lips vs. Eyes series is a makeup of the September Lippy Challenge created by Samantha and the Pan Those Miraculous palettes created by Brandy. So we're looking at the last 6 weeks of eyeshadows, and I'm just going to give you a quick recap of the shadows I used and well, the palettes I used, should I say, and my thoughts on them. This is exciting. So we have 6 weeks to get through. Let's start now. First up for week 13, which was a palette that reminded you of Thanksgiving, be it scent or name or any other reason, color story, etc. Now, we don't celebrate Thanksgiving in Australia, so I actually don't have anything that reminds me of Thanksgiving, apart from maybe the idea of a turkey, because you know, you see that in the movies, they talk about turkeys. But really, I had no palettes that reminded me of Thanksgiving, so instead I decided to stick with the idea of scent, and I went with the only palette in my collection that has a specific scent, which is my MCO Beauty Just Peachy palette. So if you can't tell, it smells like peaches. Though I will say, I have been using this palette quite heavily over the last 12 months, as this is my Do Japan, my Battleship palette, and I am finding that the scent has diminished over that time. Though, yeah, it's definitely not as strong as it was. And when it was strong, when you put the shades on your eyes, you couldn't really smell them. But this is the palette. I love this palette. I'm very pleased with this palette because it didn't cost me very much. It was about $10 and I got it from my local Woolworths. So I definitely really enjoy it. The shadows are quite lovely. I haven't had any issues with them apart from this one. I do not love this weird red one. I thought it was very much like this one, but it's quite chunky and it's really weird. I don't really know how to explain it. It's not my favorite, but every other shadow in here I haven't had any issues with, so this is definitely a good palette and it is nice and cheap. But like I said, if you're into it for the smell, after continuous use for quite a while, opening, closing, etc., the smell does seem to diminish. Week 14 is my smallest palette, and I went with the Urban Decay The Black palette. You might remember this palette from a few other episodes, and this is where I am now. I haven't really got any additional too much use from it. I tend to use this a bit more as a secondary palette for the week when I was using it. As I said before, even though the shadows look quite different when you're looking at them in the palette like this, when you lay them all out, and especially when you put them on your eyes, they are very heavily black based and they come across almost black, which is really disappointing. But I still do love this palette, so I'm definitely not going to be getting rid of it anytime soon. This is also the oldest palette currently in my collection, but it isn't a palette that you can definitely use as a standalone palette. So week 15 is a palette you bought because of YouTube that was a disappointment. And for that week, I picked the Revolution, the Emily Edit The Needs palette. And since my introduction, I have broken this palette. I dropped it and it snapped off. I had already broken the clasp and then this broke. So it's even more of a disappointment. But it is what it is and we will have to roll with it. Anyway, this is the palette. And like I've said before, I actually quite like the blush, the powder, and the highlight. I even don't mind the shade of the contour. However, contour is not necessarily my thing. Though in saying that, the concept of this palette is meant to be, it's an all-in-one palette. It's a travel palette. This is the only palette you will need. It is the needs palette. And what is my opinion on that? I don't like these 6 eyeshadows because I feel like they are kind of redundant. First off, yes, okay, I like the dark brown, but this light brown, really, you could use the contour in place of a brown. The light brown, sorry, which is Faith. Then, what about these two? Now, this one, Love, is a little bit more of, I've used it previously as a setting my primer. I've also actually been using Peace to set my primer, but previously I was using Love to set my primer. You could actually use Kindness to do that, and when I was originally trying to hit pan on this palette, I did in fact use Kindness to set my eyeshadow. So in saying that, is both Love and Peace necessary? Maybe Peace is necessary if you want to have a lighter shade to blend out and things like that, but I wouldn't say both Love and Peace are necessary. Then you have Honesty, which is a red color. Now, I don't know whether the reason why they went with this color and then you have this color. So obviously the color down the bottom here, that is the blush. The one up the top here is the eyeshadow. These are the worst swatches in the history of swatches, but it is what it is. With this color, I don't really understand the point. If you've got browns, which is essentially what these are, browns, natural eyes, right here. Because you could use just these 3 and do a whole eye look. What can you do with that red? Unless you want to use it as another blush, which makes sense. We'll chuck in a different shade of red. That could also be a blush. But you can't really mix it with any other shadows in here. And this color, which is a gunmetal grey with little red glitters in it, what is the point in that? I'm assuming the red glitters are in it to match this red shade in Honesty, but Passion and Honesty just seem so out of place. And then Faith, I really think you could really use Courage in its place. And the same goes for Love, you could use Kindness in its place. So I feel like some of this palette is redundant. I love the concept of this palette. I think that really though, I would have just liked to see the 6 eyeshadows be more useful, be a better choice in what went in there, because really I cannot really use all these shadows or even half these shadows. I can't incorporate Honesty and Passion easily into this palette, because first off, it's all warms, and then you've got this gunmetal grey. Like, these are all warm shades, and then there's this gunmetal grey, which, okay, it's got red glitter in it, but I wouldn't consider that a warm shade. And on top of that, it's really dark. So where would you put that? Would you put that as a lid shade? Well, the only shade you've got here for your other, your crease shades, etc., are browns. So it just seems a bit weird, it could have been done better. That is my opinion on it. So yes, this palette was a disappointment, and I did use this for week 15. Week 16 was my favorite palette, and for that I returned to my Beauty Bay Bright Mattes palette. So that is this one here, and I am loving this palette. This for $10, actually, sorry, yes, this was $10. This was the best $10 I have spent in a long while. I definitely do not regret buying this palette, and I would recommend it to anyone looking to get a Brights palette, be them on a budget or not. week 17 was a palette that reminded you of Santa and Santa's colors. And I went with the Alexis Stone Instinct palette by Revolution. This is another rainbow palette as such. This is what it looks like here. And I actually quite enjoy this palette. However, I will say that these shadows were not as pigmented as I thought they were originally. Though, in saying that, let me give you a bit of a swatch here. So they are quite powdery, and once you say buff them out a bit, give that a go, you can see that they're not super pigmented, and they are very powdery, but they're also quite messy. But in saying that, I used this green on my eyes the other day and it actually stained. So it wasn't really bad, but I did have staining in my crease. So I will say that though they're not as pigmented as I thought they would be, they are actually quite good. I do like this palette. I think it's mostly the black that kind of shocked me the most as the pigmentation. Like it is quite, so it's quite hit and miss. Like you've seen I did that green, it was quite good. The black is not as good. And let me try a purple because they are notoriously hard to do. So the purple though is quite good. So they're bright. That's the purple. And I'll also give you this hot pink. So this hot pink, see, though they are so powdery, but that is the hot pink there. So definitely I'm happy with this palette, but yes, they are very powdery. Though they do manage to stain a little bit. But in saying that, I would say I recommend this palette to anyone who's looking for a, I guess, is it a monochromatic look? It's, you know, where they have the color and then they have the variance of that color. So this is quite a large palette. There's 28 shadows in here, but really, if you kind of look at it in the main, you've got yellow, green, blue, gray to black, purple, pink and red. So really you've got one main color story and then they rainbow them out with different variants. In saying that, I will say some of the variants look quite similar. So like these two, for example, I can see that this one is a bit deeper and this one's a bit lighter, but I do think that on the eyes they might not look that different. Same goes for these yellows over here. They might not look that different. So really, same with this one and this one, though I can see there is a slight difference in shade. Same with this one and this one. I don't think that they will look that much different when they're actually put on the eye. Now, last but not least, the shadow that I'm using for the last week of this project is my Kaleidoscope eyeshadow palette. So this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but this is the palette that I have been using. So I don't really want to show you too much of this palette because it is a bit of a spoiler, but this is the shadow palette I used for the last week of this project. For more information about this palette, as it is my Pan That palette, make sure to check out that playlist. I'll have that linked up above. And this one was for week 16, which is a palette that gives you a prep in your step or makes you think of a new life. Now, though this didn't make me necessarily think of a new life, I looked at it as saying like this was the end of the old one. So this is the end of the last 12 months. That's why I wanted to finish up using this palette, because I've been using this palette for 12 months and I wanted to go out with a bang. So that is why this was the last palette of my year. So that is all for this video. We're not introducing any more palettes because that is the end. We're done and dusted. We are finished. So I'm going to go and wash my hands. And with that being said, I'm Verity. That was the final episode in my Lips vs. Eyes series I'm doing with Brandy, Shay and Samantha. And now to the outro.